Hello, how you doing and welcome back to the channel. Should French fans be concerned? That's what I'm going to be talking about in this video, and in particular going into the stats from their games in the opening 3 rounds of the Six Nations, which I think highlights perhaps at this moment in time why France aren't looking quite as strong as we saw them last year in 2022, where of course they won the Six Nations, they did the Grand Slam, and they went the whole calendar year unbeaten. If you are new here, do like the video, also subscribe to the channel, but most importantly, as ever, drop a comment down below. What do you make of the French performances so far in the Six Nations? And also, what do you make of my analysis in this video? I always love to hear from you. All right, let's get into it. So in answer to the question that I posed in the intro and also in the title of this video, should France be concerned, or how concerned should France be? My answer is not really, not yet, not too much, essentially. When I mean how concerned should they be, I'm kind of looking at that in a way of, are they at a point where they're dramatically dropping off and perhaps not going to be able to compete for the World Cup later this year? I don't think we're quite at that point. So what I've done in this video is look through the first 3 games of the Six Nations, particularly from a statistical point of view. I'm going to be talking about their possession stats, their kind of play style, some of the stats that tell us how they're playing, and also some of the defensive stats as well, and kind of surmise what I think it tells us about how France are playing, how it compares to how they played last year when they did the Grand Slam in the Six Nations and went the whole year unbeaten, and maybe some of the reasons why that I think France are struggling more at the moment, because actually the stats that I'm going to go into, they don't look dramatically different to how France were playing the game a year ago. And I maybe just wonder whether the game is moving on very slightly, because tactical trends do develop, they fluctuate, they go up and down in the sport. I just wonder whether maybe that is happening, and hopefully by the end of this video I would have explained why. So first of all, the possession stats from this year's Six Nations were what I looked at. And France have had less of the ball than their opponents in all 3 Six Nations games so far. So against Italy, they had 44% possession, 46% against Ireland, and 45% against Scotland. And against Italy and against Scotland, the possession that they did have, they had more of it in their opponent's half. So this kind of leads us on quite nicely to France's play style, which, to be fair, I think has been their play style since Galthie came in after the World Cup in 2019. Since 2020, they have been playing a pretty similar way, and it's been really, really effective for them. And essentially, they don't want to play in their own half. So actually what they're doing is kicking the ball away a lot, which is the reason I think for those possession stats and how they have had less than 50% of the ball in all 3 games in the Six Nations so far. However, when they do get their opportunities and when they do get the ball basically in the opponent's half, which is where they want to be, I still think they have the ability to be really dangerous and to damage teams. And I think there are stats that back that up. So against Italy and Ireland, they made more offloads than their opponents, and against both Scotland and Italy, they made more line breaks. So against Scotland and Italy, even though they had less of the ball, they still made more line breaks than their opponents. And even against Ireland, they were only 1 line break behind Ireland in that game, where I think pretty widely considered that Ireland were much the better side. Purely from a line breaks point of view, France were only 1 behind them, which I think still shows that this French attack, when they do get their hands on the ball, still can be really quite dangerous. And when you take into account that in every match France have made less passes than their opponents, and this is always quite a weird statistic, how many passes you make, but in this instance it makes sense. France are kicking the ball away a lot, they have less of the ball, their opponents are going through more phases, so therefore their opponents are making more passes. But when you consider that France have made less passes in all 3 of those games, I think what it shows us is that this French side is very tactical, but when they get the ball in the area of the pitch that they want to attack from, they are still able to do that. That's kind of what I've taken from those statistics. Let's move on to the defensive side of the game, because France's tackle percentage of tackles missed has actually been higher than their opponents in every game so far. But that's a stat that I think only tells one side of the picture, because focus on exactly what it is, percentage of tackles missed. And France at the moment are getting through more defensive work than their opponents in the opening 3 games of this Six Nations, because they've kicked the ball away, because their opponents have gone through more phases. So France are having to do more defensive work. What is really interesting though is the amount of tackles missed. So moving away from the percentage and look at the amount, because in each of those games as well, France have actually missed less tackles than all of the sides they played against, including Ireland, by the way, which I thought was really, really interesting. Again, because of how good we think of that Irish attack, actually France missed less tackles in that game than Ireland did. So actually, I think for the most part, the French defence, which has been a staple of their play since Sean Edwards came in with Fabien Galthie in 2020, I think is still pretty good. I think it's still doing overall a relatively good job, particularly when you consider that they have been put under a lot of pressure in games because sides have had the ball quite a lot. The defence is holding up relatively well to that. And also, if we want to look at the style of that defence, they made more dominant tackles than both Ireland and Scotland in those games as well. So for me, the French defence overall still has a big tick by it. So I think those stats paint a picture that there are clear positives still for France in this Six Nations. And many people might think, well, of course, they've won 2 of their 3 games. They've only lost to Ireland, who are the number 1 side in the world. They're still a good side. But I think when you look at the French performance overall, there is this perception, especially since the last Six Nations, if you want to take into account the autumn campaign, if you want to take into account the first 3 games in this Six Nations, I think there generally has been a downward trend overall in terms of performances. France have just, for whatever reason, looked a little bit less convincing. And I think what they're doing is not controlling games as much. Even though the stats suggest they're playing in a very similar fashion, I think maybe other teams are starting to play in a different way. Because as I said already, the way teams play, styles go in and out of fashion. Look back to 2019 and the fashion that won South Africa a World Cup was a big kicking game, massive in defence, squeeze teams and basically approach it like that. I think maybe the teams who have looked most impressive, I appreciate that Scotland lost to France, but the teams that have perhaps looked most impressive in Ireland and Scotland, this Six Nations, have played more with the ball, have spread it wide. Yes, they do still kick a fair bit, but they're looking to attack and be a little bit more ambitious than we've previously seen. So I think that's the reason that France, if we want to look particularly at the Scotland and Italy games, those are games where France started really, really well, got themselves into a lead, and then their opponents were able to come back at them. I don't think they've had control on games in the way that they used to. And why is that? Well, this is, as I say, completely me hypothesizing. I don't know if it's fully true, but I just wonder, and this is where I want you to drop a comment down below to see if you agree or not, if whether we are seeing sides play in a slightly different way, particularly actually Ireland, Italy and Scotland. Those are sides that are playing with it at the moment. It will be interesting to see what happens for France when they face Wales and England, because those are the sides that are at the other end of the spectrum and don't play really at all at the moment. They kick away an awful lot of ball and play the territory game, similar to what France are doing. So are we seeing a trend? And I think when the Rugby Championship starts in July, we'll get a better idea of this. But are sides approaching the game where they're looking to be more ambitious, to run more from their own half, to go through the phases more, rather than constantly kicking the ball away? And is that the reason that perhaps France haven't been as convincing in terms of their performances, even though they are still winning? That's the reason that I think, should France be concerned? Not yet, because I think they have time to address this. They clearly are still a side that can be very, very dangerous. And in fact, when you consider they haven't had as much of the ball as their opponents, when you look at the games, particularly against Italy and against Scotland, where there have been major periods of that game where they haven't had the momentum, they haven't had the ball for a long, long time, particularly in their opponent's half. When they did get into the red zone, they were still able to be very, very efficient. It's still a good French attack. Do they start to need to develop their attack and perhaps play from deeper every so often? I'm not saying every time you run it from your 22, but do they need to vary up their attack? I think they have time to do that before the World Cup, but let's wait and see, and let's see what happens. Let me know in the comments down below what you make of my views on this. Also, let me know of what you make of this style of video. I appreciate it's a lot more kind of stats heavy, and even for me doing it, I've tried to make it as straightforward as possible, but I must admit I've been doing a lot of looking at my notes on the side here to making sure that I am making sense. So drop a comment down below about that and whether you like this style of video. Let me know what you think of my hypothesis as well of this French side. You might not even agree that their performances have been any worse, but I do so far. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.